This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with James O'Brien.
It's 3 minutes after 10. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. A very good morning to you. I hope you had a lovely weekend. By heck, it's cold, isn't it? I mean, what's going on? I have my fingers. I'm reaching the age now where I can feel the weather in my joints. Do you get that yet? Oh man, usually it's my knees, but my fingers today, my actual finger joints. I'm not going to hold my finger up for the benefit of the YouTube recording of this programme, which could then, of course, be clipped up and misconstrued. I just had a funny thought. Well, I thought it was funny. You probably won't. I might change the LBC switchboard. So I've got two thoughts today on the opening question, which will be about the relationship between the UK military and Ukraine. And it's as if you rang 0345 6060 973, I'd quite like to introduce an option whereby you press 1 for overthinking and press 2 for not overthinking. I don't want to say underthinking, because there are two ways into this. And one of them, I think, or I overthink, is overthinking. And the other one is probably the one that we should do. But you know how my brain works. Brian wants to know how my toes work. I think is that not a nod to... I feel it in my fingers, I can feel it in my toes? Yes, I think it is. Well played, Brian. You go top of the class for the early inbox. And Erica has offered to send me a knitting pattern for fingerless gloves. That's not what I would call necessarily the sort of relationship that I want with my listeners, Erica. But feel free to send me completed, knitted items and garments, which I will happily wear. I've been sent socks on 2 or 3 occasions over the years. But I don't think... I'd like to think that I held a warmer place in your heart than to just be the recipient of a knitting pattern. You could perhaps knit me some mittens or some gloves yourself. No, I wear gloves. Anyway, I digress. So the overthinking question is about that relationship between the Treasury and the Ministry of Defence. In fact, I was thinking of opening the programme this morning with a quick nod towards Francis, I'm probably going to mispronounce his name now, Francis Fukuyama. Pardon? Fukuyama. Francis Fukuyama, you're familiar with Francis Fukuyama? Are you familiar? Yes, are you familiar with Francis Fukuyama, Keith? You got all his albums? He was a historian who famously observed that history had ended. He described the end of history. And the reason that was very interesting was because he thought that what you would loosely describe as liberal democracy had triumphed. If you go to the end of the Cold War, and the fall of the Berlin Wall, then you are looking at an essentially, at the time, fairly compelling argument that the progress of human history as a struggle between ideologies was over. The liberal democracy had triumphed, and the fall of Soviet Russia and the Berlin Wall would have been the sort of final nails in the coffin of that ideological warfare. He wrote, "What we may be witnessing is not just the end of the Cold War or the passing of a particular period of post-war history, but the end of history as such. That is, the end point of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government." Extraordinary to reflect upon the fact that not only, of course, is the opposite of Western liberal democracy resurgent in the guise of Vladimir Putin, but also under attack in the guise of the United States president himself. So extraordinary, really, to reflect upon how wrong Francis Fukuyama, if indeed that is how you pronounce his name, Francis Fukuyama has proved to be. So that's the overthinking part of today's conversation. The bit about spending. I wanted to ask you, how would you convince your sceptical friend, your sceptical neighbour, that the UK should spend more on spending? I told you on Friday, I was struck by that quote in the Daily Telegraph, which, as I frequently remind you, does still do some good news journalism, despite the fact that its opinion pages have become a kind of clown car. This line here, with less money, defence has to become smaller. That means fewer ships, fewer aeroplanes, fewer soldiers. But crucially, the biggest problem was making the public understand why defence needed more. This quote here is one of those ones that is going to stay with me, and I suspect with you as well. The psyche of the nation is, We aren't under attack. We aren't affected. So they don't want to take money from our roads, railways, NHS to plug defence. So that's press one for overthinking things. Okay, the question I think I should actually ask you, and that's a bit of a record, I've got around to it at 8 minutes after 10. The question I think I should actually ask you is just straight up how you feel about the fact that Keir Starmer is now potentially committing UK troops to deployment in Ukraine. Is peacekeeping troops a bit of an oxymoron? Peacekeeping troops? How do they keep the peace? Well, they're troops. They've got guns. So how do they keep the peace? By firing their guns. Is that key? Is that? Can you be a peacekeeping troop with a gun? What are you going to do with a gun? I'm going to shoot people. What? So, but you're keeping the peace. So they're there. What do you think? 0345 6060 973. European leaders meeting in Paris today to discuss the Ukraine war. Some growing sort of sense that the negotiations that the Americans are keen to lead won't involve Ukraine. That great phrase we learnt last week from our caller from, I think she was a Slovakian, about us but without us, talking about the post-war settlement, or talking about the 1938 Munich settlement, about us but without us, as if the big heavy hitters on the international stage can discuss the fate of populations and discuss the fate of nations without actually referencing the populations involved, without actually consulting the populations that are most affected. PM puts pressure on European leaders to do the same at today's peace talks in Paris. So he will say today that he is willing to put troops on the ground in Ukraine and call upon European allies to do the same. I saw a line this morning that actually stopped me in my tracks. I won't tell you who it was because I don't want to embarrass them or cause any form of pylon. But I saw a line from a British journalist I really respect, and it just said, "I'm proud of my government today." And I thought, what's that about then? There's a line you don't see very often. I am proud of my government today. And the reason for that pride, I presume, and it wasn't part of a thread, so I could have completely got the wrong end of the stick. He might be proud of the government for an entirely different reason. It might be the NHS figures that we will have a look at a little later in the programme. But the simple decision to put or to consider putting British servicemen and women in harm's way is a reason for pride, national pride, patriotic pride, or pride in the government. And my sort of slightly childish quibbles about the salience of the notion of peacekeeping troops aside, I want to know two things. I want to know what you think. Has he done the right thing? Is he doing the right thing? And what it will mean. So since the invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, no British Prime Minister has publicly considered sending British soldiers to the country. We know that Emmanuel Macron has spoken very favourably or positively about the prospect of a Europe-led peacekeeping force. And today, in the Daily Telegraph, interestingly enough, they still probably lead the line on defence journalism. Sir Keir Starmer has written that he is willing to do it. The first time he has explicitly said he is considering the deployment of British peacekeepers to Ukraine. And I'll quote you what he said. "I do not say that lightly. I feel very deeply the responsibility that comes with potentially putting British servicemen and women in harm's way. But any role in helping to guarantee Ukraine's security is helping to guarantee the security of our continent and the security of this country. The end of this war, when it comes, cannot merely become a temporary pause before Putin attacks again." You put alongside that Volodymyr Zelensky's comments that if Putin is allowed to prevail in Ukraine, he will attack the rest of Europe next. He will attack other parts of Europe next. And that takes us back to where we were last week, doesn't it? In the contemplation of 1938 and 1939, the annexation of Sudetenland, the invasion of Poland. I don't know what the public opinion was, or even what the mainstream media opinion was. And I know that much of the media, particularly the Daily Mail, was very, very warm towards Adolf Hitler until suddenly it wasn't. But was there a sense of, he'll be satisfied now he's got Poland. He'll be satisfied now he's got Sudetenland. Churchill, I think fairly, is regarded as the one who knew, the one who saw the scale of the imperial ambition, the one who understood that the Nazi project would not ever stop or be satisfied, a kind of Roman Empire type of dream, or a Reich, to be more accurate. I don't know what parallels you draw. I don't know what historical parallels are most helpful with the idea that, oh, don't be silly, of course he'll stop then. Because he didn't stop after Crimea. He bided his time. He waited to see how the West would react. The West sat on its hands. The West essentially bottled it, as indeed they did in Syria as well, with the red lines crossed and the response non-existent. And therefore he had a crack at Ukraine, thinking that it would go as easily and as swimmingly, from his point of view, as the invasion of Crimea. So 14 after 10 is the time. So what do we think? Press 1 for overthinking, press 2 for just thinking. And today it's press 2. What do we actually think? Just pause for a minute and forget about the context in which we talk to each other every morning. Yeah, the nature of a phone-in show being that we cast around for conversational topics. My job is to find things that are interesting. And some days it's harder to do that than it is on other days. And I've said to you a million times that the most important stories are not necessarily the most obvious topics for us to discuss. Otherwise, we just listen to Thomas's headlines and focus on the first 3, do an hour on each of the first 3 headlines. It doesn't work like that, as you know. But what I do know is that this is huge. And we forget sometimes, or we lose sight sometimes, of how huge moments can be, because we have to have moments every day. We always have to have something to talk about. We always have to have an issue to discuss, a conversation to conduct, a debate, perhaps, to have. And yet, this is huge, right? This is the Prime Minister, our Prime Minister, putting pressure on European leaders to follow his commitment to putting British troops, the brothers, the sisters, the sons, the daughters, the mothers, the fathers of people listening to this program on the ground in Ukraine, in the path of Putin's murderous invading forces. So I'd like to think I can just leave you with that today. Is this the right decision by Keir Starmer? 0345 6060 973. Are you, like me, somewhat surprised to find yourself feeling a stirring of pride? Remember, the troops are committed to the idea of upholding any peace that is achieved, supporting Ukraine. It's not that they are joining Ukraine in their assaults upon Russia. So that's why peacekeeping forces is not actually an oxymoron. But, we talk a lot about thin ends of wedges, don't we? Incremental creep, mission creep is a familiar phrase to anyone who's followed international engagements over the last few years. Is it silly of me, foolish of me, warmongering of me to feel, as many this morning I think will do, a sense of pride in the leadership being shown by Keir Starmer? And regardless of what your answer may be to those first 2 questions, what does it mean? What might it mean? Hit the numbers now. You will get through. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. Starmer, I'm ready to put troops in Ukraine, going somewhere that no UK Prime Minister has gone. And we've had quite a few since February 2022. It's easy to forget that sometimes. Is he right? Are you proud? What does it mean? You can answer 1, 2 or 3 of those questions by dialing 0345 6060 973. It's 10:17.
James O'Brien on LBC.
17 after 10 is the time. A quick glance at the inbox and then we shall return to the switchboard. Jay's in Runcorn. He writes, I think Starmer has played a blinder here. If he puts the UK into Ukraine as peacekeepers, then by rights it should force a withdrawal by Russia because an act of aggression against them is an attack on NATO. That forces Trump to get out of bed with Putin. I wouldn't count your chickens on that one, Jay. Starmer has grasped the nettle and taken the action needed to see an end to the conflict. I like the second half of that, and I like the second third, the third, and the first third, but I think the middle third might be a little bit optimistic. I think this is an important point, but I don't know if it is as powerful as you consider it to be. Rory says the first question that should be asked of any supporter of this is, will your children be serving on the front line? Is it, Rory? Really? I mean, my children are not in the army. And they haven't chosen to be in the army. And as things stand, they're too young to be in the army. But if my children had chosen to be in the army, then they would have known that they are deployed at the behest of our Prime Minister, our government. So I understand why people think that's a rhetorically powerful flourish. Would you send your own children? But I think you're actually patronising and insulting people who've chosen to serve king and country. Theirs is not to reason why, as Tennyson famously observed in a rather different context, I grant you. Theirs is not to reason why. Theirs is just to do or die. So I get it. And I think possibly when I was a younger man, possibly an undergraduate, I too would have thought that was a powerful point to make. But I don't think that it is. That's something else we can discuss this morning. Let's go first, though, to Bury. Alan is there. Alan, what would you like to say?
Morning, James.
Hello.
Starmer has done the right thing. As you say, he's grasped the nettle. But, this is just the start of it, James, because the second thing he has to do is probably get onto the chairman of BAE Systems and say, I need another 48 Typhoons and I need more frigates, I need more submarines, because, we now have to rearm. The world's changed last week. Yeah. And the one thing... You've done...
You know what you've done? You've pressed 1 and 2 on my switchboard. You've pressed 1 for overthinking and you've pressed 2 for just thinking, because you've gone immediately into the much broader ramifications of what's on the table here, which is probably inevitable, but beyond the simple wisdom or otherwise of Starmer committing UK troops. I think you're right, for what it's worth. I think the world has changed in the last week.
Well, I think James, what he has to do is then get on to Macron and Scholz and just say, are you following suit?
Mm. That's exactly what's happening. That is. Yeah. I mean, certainly as it's being reported today, and the timbre of Starmer's piece in the Telegraph is very much that I am going to Paris, and Macron, we know, is already on side to urge other European leaders to follow my lead, especially, as you identify, Alan, a historically reluctant Germany. This is a European peacekeeping force in Ukraine.
I think we have to send a message to Trump and say this is our continent, because the one thing that odious man is right about, the only thing,
yes,
is that we haven't spent enough on defence.
Yes.
And as a Labour man, I think you recognise my voice, James, is Keir Starmer has been left a black hole of neglect of our armed forces. We are pitiful. I mean, I think we've probably got below 80,000 troops, and if you put troops on the ground, there's all like the logistics to back them up. There's probably the armoured personnel carriers, there's the helicopters, and probably people are running around Whitehall now with the MOD saying, right, what do we need? Are we going to send the paratroops? Are we going to send the Marines? Are we going to send this? Have we got them? Have we got the troops? And because
I mean, there's a million different questions here, isn't there?
Yeah.
I mean, have we got the military capability to do X? Is not the same question as have we got the military capability to do Y. So in the first instance, putting troops on the ground in Ukraine as part of, I don't think he'd act unilaterally, but as part of a European peacekeeping force. We have the wherewithal to do that in the context of the new threat, that the absolute disappearance of Fukuyama's claim that history had ended, that liberal democracy had proved so successful against totalitarian ideological rivals that we don't need to worry anymore about. That is categorically over, and that's the next stage of the conversation. That's the question of whether or not a population that's not under attack can be persuaded that it needs to spend more money on defence against a currently non-existent attack. And as you know, historically, that's a very tricky thing to do. Thank you, Alan. It's a perfect start. We'll go to Lee and Hitchin next. Before that, I've got a thought. And it's a weird thought, and I told you this would happen. I told you that the woman I sat alongside in a canteen in Hounslow last week at Jewellery Service, who was parroting with incredible confidence pro-Kremlin social media misinformation. Everything from Zelensky being spending all the money that he gets from the West on luxury yachts for himself. He's got 3 yachts worth $270 million. And she just spoke with such absolute confidence. And probably my inverted snobbery was noted it more because, you know, she was sort of quite twinset and pearlsy. She was quite middle class. And talking about Michelle Obama being a man, passing her phone around the table to show the proof, all of this being absolutely top drawer misinformation, almost certainly originally coming out of those bot farms in St. Petersburg. And if you then look at the support for what Keir Starmer is doing, party by party, it's really striking how out of kilter with the 3 main parties Nigel Farage's outfit is. Nigel Farage, of course, has described Vladimir Putin as the political leader he admires the most in the world. May have changed now that Donald Trump is in the White House. I don't know. So that the role. That's why I'm only mentioning that because I keep saying we're not under attack. Tell that to Dawn Sturgis's family, murdered by Putin's goons in Salisbury. You know, tell that to the Skripals, who mercifully survived the same murderous mission. It's. Do you see what I mean? We're not under attack, but we actually are under attack and have been for a very long time. The mission of Vladimir Putin to destabilize the West, to undermine the liberal democracy that Francis Fukuyama thought back in whenever it was that he wrote his The End of History and the Last Man. That 1989, I think that idea that we're not under attack is probably naive. But anyway, it's not necessarily what we're talking about today. Lee is in Hitchin to talk about Keir Starmer's commitment to, or at least statement of readiness, Lee, to put troops in Ukraine. What would you like to say?
Hello, James. Hello. This is actually, I think, the 3rd time that you and I have spoken. I'm the somewhat weird bloke who does yoga in military hospitals in Ukraine.
Yes. No, military rehabilitation via yoga. Yeah, you're a fascinating man and you do incredible work. I'm glad that you found some time to ring me today.
Thank you. Well, you've actually caught me. I'm actually standing here with my suitcase packed on my way to Stansted to go to Shekov and then back to Lviv tomorrow. So
good grief.
I had to ring in.
Yes, absolutely.
I'm definitely in the camp of overthinking. I'm going to warn you. I'm one of the world's biggest overthinkers. So in response to your question, I've overthought all of this. As you can imagine, it keeps me awake at night, and events of the last couple of weeks have given me nightmares, to be quite honest.
I'm sure.
The short answer is, in my heart, I would love to see anything that brings us about a security guarantee for Ukraine for the future. And if that entails peacekeeping forces, NATO forces, and therefore by extension, British forces on the ground in Ukraine, in my heart, my Ukrainian heart, I'm British, but my heart and soul is in Ukraine. I want to say this is a good thing. However, events of the last 2 weeks and knowing how Putin operates and understanding as well from being in Ukraine just how long this conflict has been going on for. You know, this conflict did not start in February 22. And it didn't start when Russia invaded Crimea either. This is a centuries-old conflict. And we will be embroiling ourselves in a situation that I fear could escalate rapidly. And secondly, I fear that we are walking into a trap of Putin's making. And by that, I mean that Putin, the Russians, on the battlefield, we like to think of them in Ukraine as being quite stupid, quite backward. Their equipment is degraded. Their troops are inexperienced and poorly equipped and poorly trained. But on a global geopolitical level, the Russians have been playing a game of 5D chess for a very long time. And as you said earlier, we've been at war for a very long time. We just don't know it. We just don't realise it.
I do think that's true.
And I think that the peace talks that are taking... They're not peace talks, they're surrender talks, by the way.
Well, they can't be surrender talks because Ukraine's not there. I had to double-check that. I thought I'd misremembered. Yeah. So they're going to Saudi Arabia. The United States and Russia are going to Saudi Arabia to have peace talks about a war in Ukraine that Ukraine is not party to.
Exactly. And so we've got a situation where we're not talking about appeasement. I believe this is alignment on Trump's part, not appeasement. It's alignment. It's very different to Chamberlain. And I think that we've got a situation where we've got Putin playing 5D chess against the chimpanzee on the other side of the board.
Yeah, okay. I understand where you're coming from. Shashank Joshi is someone I often turn to in these moments, defense editor at The Economist. And he makes the point that the actual deployment would not be like we are used to seeing in Europe. It would be a reassurance force to the rear, not at the front, right, and not at all like NATO battle groups in Eastern Europe. That's option one. And option two would be a peacekeeping type force at the post-ceasefire line of contact. So, I mean, the idea that British troops are going to arrive and head straight towards the front line and start killing Russians is not on the table.
Okay, that's good to know. That idea.
I think that's important. Go on.
My concern of us being walked into a trap, and the reason I referenced the fact that this war has been going on for centuries, is the fact that the Russians have a playbook. We know what it is now. They've shown it to us several times. They've done it in the Donbass, where for years we've been hearing about Ukrainian separatists, when in fact they're actually Chechen troops that they've bussed in to wreak havoc in those regions. In Crimea, remember the little green men that were clearly Russian soldiers, yes, murdering people and causing mayhem in Crimea. And the Russians point blank looked down the camera and said they don't belong to us when they were clearly Russian troops. What we're going to see in Ukraine is if we don't see a withdrawal to internationally recognized borders, i.e. Russia withdraws to Russia and Ukraine restores its territory back, what we're going to see is a continuation of those tactics. We're going to see little green men in those border regions. We're going to see false flag operations by the Russians causing mayhem. All of which
is relevant and pertinent, but not actually reasons not to do the right thing. And the right thing surely is
in the right context.
Yeah, and that's why I think it's keen to be clear about what is on the table and what is not. So, a peacekeeping force in Europe to protect the parameters of any peace deal, or to sort of be around the back of the Ukrainian forces as a sort of bulwark or as a form of security, a reassurance force, if you like, to the rear, are not, I don't think, risking some of the things you fear. But hey, I mean, that would be tomorrow. Goodness knows what happens the day after that, or the day after that, or the day after that. What time's your flight?
5:30 to Sheshov.
All right, well, take care, all right?
Thank you, James.
And I'll speak to you again soon. It's 10:32. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Jackie makes a valid point, and I apologise for not making it myself. She says, don't forget Nick Bailey, the police officer who was poisoned in Salisbury and whose family home was also contaminated. I don't forget Nick Bailey. I've had the pleasure of meeting him, actually. He's a fantastic bloke, and his wife. And I meet them when I attend events that are populated in large part by Russian dissidents, by people, including my friend Vladimir Kara-Murza, who Vladimir Putin has tried to murder. So quite what the US Vice President JD Vance was talking about when he stood up in Munich last week and suggested that my freedom of speech is the real thing that's under threat here. People in Britain and Europe are having their freedom of speech eroded when Vladimir Putin, who kind of got a free pass from JD Vance, murders critics. We may get onto that a little later today. 10:33 is the time. Thomas Watts has your headline.
James O'Brien on LBC.
36 is the time. It's an interesting moment historically as well, isn't it? The UK showing some leadership, almost military leadership, certainly with the readiness to deploy troops in Ukraine. Keir Starmer's mission to Paris, designed in large part to persuade other European leaders to join some form of European peacekeeping force on the ground in Ukraine. France, Germany, Italy, Poland, Spain, the Netherlands, Denmark, the European Commission, the European Council and NATO all attending this meeting. No one's clear yet what a European-led peacekeeping force in Ukraine would look like, but it's the prospect of it rises only because of what was essentially done to NATO. Donald Trump and JD Vance letting down the tyres, if you like, of NATO last week. None of which is permanent. And you say what you like about Donald Trump. Just because he did something on Monday doesn't mean he'll still want to do the same thing on Wednesday. Or just because he said on Tuesday that he was going to do something on Thursday doesn't mean he won't be doing the polar opposite by Friday. 10:37 is the time. I'm interested in what you think about this. 3 prongs of inquiry this morning. The first is, how do you respond to a British Prime Minister, in this case Keir Starmer, stating that he is ready to put troops in Ukraine? Number 2, is it jingoistic, foolish, naive, dangerous to feel a scintilla of patriotic pride at the sight of a UK Prime Minister after the disasters we've had in that role in recent years, doing the right thing, in the same way that even Boris Johnson, like a stopped clock being right twice a day, made me feel a bit proud when he led the line on sending aid to Ukraine. And then the third question is, what will it mean? I've got another question as well, but not for today. I remember when Brexiters used to ring me before it became absolutely inarguable and irrefutable that they had been sold the mother of all pups. Do you remember Farage's line about a European army? It's terrible. If we don't leave the European Union, there's going to be a European army. And I used to say to you, what's wrong with that? Surely an army we're in is not a threat. I'm not a historian, as you know, but I'm fairly confident that the armies you need to worry most about as a nation are the armies that you're not in. As in the armies that are full of foreign people who wish you harm, or are led by leaders who wish you harm. So a European army with the UK taking a key role, what exactly was I supposed to be scared of? I wonder whether Putin's patsy, Nigel Farage, will be returning to that rhetoric anytime soon. That a European army would be a terrible thing, because a European peacekeeping force with Sir Keir Starmer at the moment marshalling the troops looks to me to be rather a good thing. Hey, I could be missing something. That's nice from Catherine. I'm so glad James is back, making sense of the madness. Trying, Catherine. Always trying to make sense of the madness. Sadly, not always succeeding. Elsie is in Brussels. Elsie, what would you like to say?
Hi, I would just like to mention the fact that you had peacekeeping forces on the streets of the north of Ireland, and the only thing it resulted in was walls, and more walls, which still stand today. So to me, I think it's a bit preemptive of Keir Starmer to go in as leading this charge. It should be more of a European coalition around this issue.
I think perhaps I haven't explained it very well. He definitely would not be doing anything unilaterally. It did categorically. I mean, Macron is already fairly on board with this. The key stumbling point would be Germany, Olaf Scholz. But it would be a European peacekeeping force, not by any stretch of the imagination, a uniquely British one.
And does this not just place then a European peacekeeping force in between Russia and Ukraine for Russia to then goad them into some sort of wider conflict?
Well, no, I don't think it does. But of course, you never say never. But what would the alternative be?
Well, I don't see an alternative to this situation until you've got a military that's at least coalescing around one single issue.
That's what Starmer's trying to do today. The alternative I meant was what do you do to Russia if not this?
Well, I would say every country being able to at least guarantee a certain percentage of their military spend towards Ukraine.
Again, you're a bit further ahead of me. I'm talking about on the ground in Ukraine today. If this is not policy for European allies, then what is? With regard to the message Putin is being sent, having mounted an illegal invasion of Ukraine. You've got a man in the White House now saying, I don't think Ukraine should have got involved in this war, as if they somehow elected to get invaded by Vladimir Putin.
No, of course they didn't.
Or did something wrong by resisting. So in the context, I don't want to sound like I'm badgering you, but just I want to be absolutely clear that you know what question I'm asking. In the context of European policy towards this war today, what's the option if not this?
I don't see it as the only option that needs to be taken.
Good. So
sure.
What are the other ones?
From my side, I would say just more of a coming together across Europe to be able to hash out a plan. Do you know what I mean? I understand that you've got Putin.
I don't know what you mean. I don't mean that as a criticism. I mean more of the people across Europe coming together to hash out a plan. I genuinely don't know what that means.
It's fine by me.
Huh?
It's fine by me. I'm just trying to say that there is obviously a peril when you start to put forces in an active conflict. I
don't want to lecture you on the history of the north of Ireland, but the exact quote of the British Army's role was to support the RUC in the defeat of terrorism, which is about 465 million miles away from a peacekeeping role on the ground in Ukraine today.
No, of course there are different places historically, for sure.
Completely. I mean, it's your home, so I'm not going to start giving you history lessons about it. But I don't personally see the parallels. That could be my fault. Thank you, Elsie. Matt's in Hull. Matt, what would you like to say?
Hello, James.
Hello, Matt.
I think the idea of a beefed up military and a European defence identity, as they sort of call it, would be a great thing. But at the same time, under current circumstances, I would be mortified if we put British troops into Ukraine, just because after 3 years of this war, which is a war that no NATO nation has participated in anything like this for decades, this kind of attritional, almost First World War trench warfare and artillery, and no NATO countries fought that. We've been largely fighting in the Middle East, where it's all about fast manoeuvre and taking key places very quickly. We've had massive superiority in terms of air cover and that kind of thing. We haven't faced anything like this. And
so these are logistical concerns, but and they're valid. I sense that you've probably got some military experience yourself if you're going to be if you're taking this perspective.
Or security services, but we've spoken before. My dad did a lot of work with NATO for years and years. Yeah. So, and the idea of a European defence identity is not new. I mean, back when Willy Brandt was German Chancellor and Heath was Prime Minister, and I forget who was the French, it wasn't Mitterrand, but they suggested that Europe should rely less on American troops and American bases and build this European defence identity, and the US quashed that because they wanted to carry on having an influence, because when NATO was created, behind the scenes, it wasn't the sort of publicly stated purpose, but it was always said that the purpose of NATO was to keep America in, Russia out, and Germany down. That was the phrase always deployed. And that's changing now.
It's changing as we watch. It's changing in real time. It's why the first caller talked about the world changing last week in a way that people haven't fully caught up with. All I'd counter your point with is that analysis from the defence editor of The Economist talking about what is actually being proposed, and neither of which at the moment involves what you fear, and what you almost certainly rightly describe as being something we wouldn't be very well equipped to provide. So it's a reassurance force to the rear, nothing like NATO battle groups in Eastern Europe, or a peacekeeping type force at the post-ceasefire lines of contact. So possibly, to go back to Elsie in Brussels, that there would be walls, so to speak, but I say walls, you say borders, and one sounds good, one sounds bad. So I don't know that the fears you have are on the table yet.
My worry is it would be more like what's referred to as a tripwire force, where, because we've already had, whether we don't openly say so, but we've already had troops in Ukraine, and we've lost troops in Ukraine. We've had SAS and SBS killed. We've had commandos killed over there, and a lot of them died in Lviv when a training centre where we were training Ukrainian officers was attacked and annihilated, destroyed by the Russians very early on in the war. So being behind the lines is
no guarantee of safety, but it is. I only mentioned it as a counter to what you were describing about the logistical inadequacies, or not by any sense minimising the risks or the potential for what you described. But it just in the context of us not having any experience in fighting this kind of war, there is no suggestion today that we I use the word very loosely, would be fighting any kind of war. It's why I was probably a bit silly of me to giggle at the oxymoronic potential of the phrase peacekeeping forces. Of course, it's a real and viable proposition, and we've seen it proved as such on many occasions. But yeah, I mean, you make valid points. It's certainly not black and white. 10:46 is the time. But that question of what are the alternatives now, I mean, you've got that phrase that I'd not heard before, to my embarrassment perhaps, about us but without us, in discussing the carving up of Czechoslovakia or after the annexation of Sudetenland. Thank you for correcting my pronunciation of that, by the way. My inbox is a wonderful place. And that phrase, about us but without us, was introduced to this programme last week before it was announced that there would be a meeting in Saudi Arabia this week between Russia and America, the United States of America, to discuss Ukraine, with Ukraine absent, about us but without us. I mean, that's mad, right? If you needed an illustration of why that phrase was resurrected last week from 1938 in 2025, they've just showed you. It's 10:47.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It's 10 to 11. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I didn't forget my name there. I was just reading a message because that's the previous caller referencing Willy Brandt and Ted Heath. He forgot who was in charge in France. It was, Les reminds us, Edouard Pompidou, him of the famous centre in it. I'd love spending time with you every day. I think I would have gone mad years ago if I didn't have this opportunity to try and work things out. But there are moments of epic importance that you don't properly register because you're in the middle of them. It was possibly the first caller today off to Ukraine later this afternoon, having been there and back pretty much since the outbreak of war, working in the sphere of rehabilitation of people injured in this war. Talking about the world changed last week. If you want to take your lead from people like Andrew Neil writing in the Daily Mail, then there's nothing much to worry about and everything is perfectly normal and possibly even inevitable. But if you're paying proper attention and you haven't had your brain boiled by years of support for Brexit or Liz Truss or whatever other element of right-wing politics you've been blindly supportive of for the last 20 years, then the world is changing. It's deeply significant. The best thing you've got, the nearest thing you've got to relief is the absolute unreliability of Donald Trump and the fact that just because he says stuff doesn't mean he'll do it. But on this issue of Europe needs to look after itself, we don't want to anymore, you can dress it up rhetorically as attractive, protectionism. But NATO is a post-war construct designed to keep Russia at bay and also to keep Germany suppressed, as our earlier caller Matt reminded us. And that's no longer necessary, even with the far right back in a form of on the march in Germany. That the idea of a resurgent Nazi movement in Germany itself is still, I think, for the birds. So you don't need to worry about that. So what is the dilution of NATO most likely to achieve? Well, it will be the removal of resistance to Russian imperial ambitions, which have come back at a rate of knots since Gorbachev and Yeltsin, really. That idea that Francis Fukuyama wrote about in 1989, that history was over because Western liberal democracy, or not even Western, liberal democracy had triumphed. The end of history was the title of the article. Marxism and fascism had both failed. Liberal democracy had thrived. The Berlin Wall had come down. The Soviet Union had fallen. Therefore, history was over. You wouldn't get that past a commissioning editor today, would you? 10:53 is the time. Oliver is in Camberley. Oliver, what would you like to say?
Oh, good morning. I think that putting our troops on the ground publicly in Ukraine would be a very bad idea. I don't think we've really got a handle on what we would do if they actually had to do something. What happens if we've got... I've been listening to what you've been talking about. If we have troops in the rear providing logistical, whatever type of support, and there is a long-range drone strike and we lose 1, 10, 15, 20 soldiers in a drone strike, do we retaliate? As the UK, do we not?
I don't know.
We don't, these are the problems that need to be thought about before we get into this issue. I was speaking with your producer before I came on, and my battalion was in Bosnia in 1995, 1996. We were very much there on our own because we were part of the UN mandate in those days, before the big NATO surge under Tony Blair.
Yeah.
And without the might of the US behind us, we would be completely toothless because we don't have the capability to do anything.
We're thinking about things like enforcing a no-fly zone or naval blockades or anything that demands the heft of US involvement. But were there not?
No. We're talking about soldiers who had to keep their heads down because we couldn't actually respond.
So I was about to say, surely that was the case then as well. So you're learning from that and saying we shouldn't do that again.
I'm saying we definitely shouldn't do that again. My battalion was very lucky. We left at the beginning of 1996, and the battalion that replaced us had to walk out across the mountains because it was no longer tenable for them to stay in Gorazda.
So what is the alternative? I mean, I don't know. You know more about this than I do, but I would imagine these are the conversations that will be held in Paris this week. It will be about much more. If there is to be a European peacekeeping force on the ground, then the terms of engagement will have to be a heck of a lot more detailed and clear than they are in Keir Starmer's article.
Absolutely. Rules of engagement are super important. It allows the soldiers on the ground to respond as the politicians require them to. Unfortunately, the other side doesn't necessarily see it that way. So as soon as we respond under our rules of engagement, what do the Russians do? Does that escalate the situation?
So this is mission creep.
Do we get into a shooting war in Europe? In Europe, do we get into a shooting war? Or do we turn around and say, unfortunately, Ukraine, you have to be the buffer that we had during the post-Second World War period with the Iron Curtain. You cannot join NATO. That would be an absolute
And then we come back to confidence. Hang on, I just want to point out what Zelensky has said about that. And it does come down to how much confidence you have in the idea that Putin would be satisfied, as it were, and that any imperial ambitions had been sated. It's a question. It's not a statement. That's what he has said.
Okay, but then we get into a situation where we are today without having to change anything. What happens if Putin goes beyond Ukraine? He invades NATO as it sits today.
Which is what Zelensky is saying will happen.
But why do we have to coin the phrase, and I think it's relevant, poke the bear, the Russian bear, by making Ukraine part of NATO, when if what we're really worried about
you're not poking a bear by resisting an illegal invasion. Or perhaps you think you are.
You're putting NATO troops, European troops...
Poking a bear involves provoking somebody for no reason whatsoever who is capable of doing you great harm when provoked. It's a really unhelpful analogy. It's not the first time I've heard it, but was declaring war on Hitler in 1939 poking a bear?
No, he crossed the line by invading Poland.
Well, he crossed the line by invading Ukraine.
No. Well, we told him not to invade Poland. He invaded Poland.
We didn't invite Vladimir Putin to invade Ukraine.
But now we can allow is the wrong word. We need to figure out a way for we need to figure out a way for the Ukrainians and the Russians to coexist in that particular part of the world as well as is possible.
Yeah.
What we shouldn't be doing is trying to impose our will on the Russians.
I think you've heard what you've said. It's not imposing our will, as you said yourself. It's not, it wasn't poking a bear when we responded to Hitler's invasion of Poland, nor would it be poking a bear when we respond to Putin's invasion of Ukraine. The bear is attacking, mate. You can poke it all you want. It's already killing people in Ukraine.
And that's
why it's such an unhelpful analogy, isn't it, really?
No, it's not.
A bear is in a cage. I mean, the whole analogy is about you poke a bear when it's placid and calm and not doing anything wrong, and suddenly it will rise up against you. I've heard Nigel Farage use the phrase, the biggest fanboy for Vladimir Putin ever to achieve a seat in the House of Commons in this country. It's not helpful. And I don't like reaching immediately for parallels with 1938 and 1939, but you've got a peace negotiation taking place without the country that has been invaded being present, and you have got an illegal invasion of sovereign territory with NATO being deflated as we speak by the President of the United States of America. And so, I mean, your experience notwithstanding, all bets are off with regard to looking at this through a lens of what we might expect NATO to do or what we might expect America to do. It's a new world order that is being formed before our very eyes. And it's not one in which I don't believe, and I'm absolutely happy to disagree with you on this, on which you pat Vladimir Putin on the back and say, oh, don't worry, we'll coexist happily in Ukraine. You carry on with your territorial ambitions because we never actually told you not to invade Ukraine. So it's nothing like all other previous invasions of sovereign countries because Hitler was categorically told to keep his hands off Poland. It's 11 o'clock.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It's 4 minutes after 11, and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I mentioned Roe versus Wade to you quite a lot last year. I don't know if you remember why. It's a great illustration for me of the absence of permanence in politics. Oddly, looking at that Fukuyama quote that we began the programme with this morning, the idea that anything is ever settled forever is wrong, isn't it? And you think of things like Roe versus Wade, which enshrined an American woman's bodily autonomy, freedom to access abortion, and then it got turned over by Donald Trump's Supreme Court, or the people that Donald Trump had put on the Supreme Court. I only focus on that because it was huge, probably because I went to a Catholic school. I went to a Catholic monastic school, and we were very much inculcated with anti-abortion rhetoric successfully for years. Most of us would have reached our teenage years at that school convinced that abortion was a terrible thing. It was an all-boys school as well, run by all-male monks, appropriately enough or not. And I guess we focused on it a lot. I did an A-level in comparative US-UK politics, and abortion was huge, a huge issue. And it will be again. So JD Vance, the US Vice President, gave a speech last week which was stunning in its content. He essentially, remember that Vladimir Putin kills people, right? Alexander Litvinenko, Alexei Navalny. I've had the privilege of meeting both of their widows on more than one occasion. I know these people. I mentioned earlier, I've met the police officer who was poisoned during the attempts to kill the Skripals when they accidentally killed a woman called Dawn Sturgis. Marina Litvinenko was sitting in this studio in February of 2023, marking 1 year since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, so 2 years ago. I know these people a bit. And the idea of a US vice president essentially launching an ideological assault on Europe, on Vladimir Putin's enemies, is one that I cannot get my head around. JD Vance accusing European leaders of suppressing free speech, failing to halt illegal migration, and running in fear from voters' true beliefs. It's as if the sort of far-right internet corridors have somehow managed to lead all the way into the Oval Office. And some of the examples he gave are just not true. Abortion was the one he particularly zoned in on. This idea that in this country you're not allowed to pray, or you're not allowed to object to abortion, that you have buffer zones around clinics. Well, I'll give you some of the details of some of the examples he cited, because he must know they're not true. You'd think, wouldn't you, if you were the Vice President of the United States, you'd check before giving a speech whether or not its contents were true. But that's not the point, is it? The point is, the audience want to hear what he has to say. And what audience is he talking to? What audience is he appealing to? I don't know. I don't know. I don't know what the game is. Do you want to hear a bit? Do you want to hear it? So here is JD Vance, the Vice President of the United States, as you know, at a conference in Munich, essentially designed to address the threats coming from Russia, among other things, the Munich Security Conference, so a conference about the security of Europe. I don't think you need to be Henry Kissinger or one of his latter-day equivalents to recognize that the key threats to security in Europe at the moment come from Russia and, to a lesser extent, from China. Not if you're the Vice President of the United States.
The threat that I worry the most about vis-a-vis Europe is not Russia, it's not China, it's not any other external actor. And what I worry about is the threat from within, the retreat of Europe from some of its most fundamental values, values shared with the United States of America. I look to our very dear friends, the United Kingdom, where the backslide away from conscience rights has placed the basic liberties of religious Britons in particular in the crosshairs. A little over 2 years ago, the British government charged Adam Smith Connor, a 51-year-old physiotherapist and an Army veteran, with the heinous crime of standing 50 meters from an abortion clinic and silently praying for 3 minutes. not obstructing anyone, not interacting with anyone, just silently praying on his own. And after British law enforcement spotted him and demanded to know what he was praying for, Adam replied simply, it was on behalf of the unborn son he and his former girlfriend had aborted years before. Now, the officers were not moved. Adam was found guilty of breaking the government's new buffer zones law, which criminalizes silent prayer and other actions that could influence a person's decision within 200 meters of an abortion facility. He was sentenced to pay thousands of pounds in legal costs to the prosecution. Now, I wish I could say that this was a fluke, a one-off crazy example of a badly written law being enacted against a single person. But no, this last October, just a few months ago, the Scottish government began distributing letters to citizens whose houses lay within so-called safe access zones, warning them that even private prayer within their own homes may amount to breaking the law. Naturally, the government urged readers to report any fellow citizens suspected guilty of thought crime. In Britain and across Europe, free speech, I fear, is in retreat. In Washington, there is a new sheriff in town, and under Donald Trump's leadership, we may disagree with your views, but we will fight to defend your right to offer it in the public square, agree or disagree.
I hadn't heard the applause at the end. There's about 6 people. I don't know how many people were in the room, but there's 2 or 3 clapping very, very hard to try to cover up the fact that most people are sort of reeling in shock from this. And he then went off for a meeting with the leader of the AfD as opposed to with the Chancellor of Germany, the far right, a political movement born of sort of founded by descendants of actual Nazis. You can tell how far right they are. Nigel Farage gave a speech to them not long ago. So I don't understand this, and I'm not. I don't think I'm being naive. I mean, if you're the president of vice president of the United States of America, and you are saying to European leaders that the regime that kills critics, the regime that sends its own goons to cathedral cities like Salisbury with the express intention of murdering dissidents and not caring a jot for the damage done to homegrown or British-born residents of the same city, are not the real threat. The real threat is an at best exaggerated and at worst completely confected account of events outside abortion clinics. The man he refers to, Adam Smith Connor, was not arrested for praying. He was convicted. So, it's not just police doing this, it's the legal system breaching the rules of a buffer zone. The idea is that young women or older women, any women, are able to access an abortion clinic without being in any way harassed or emotionally challenged by protesters or by people opposed to the freedoms they are exercising. He was invited to move along. He refused. That's why he was arrested. That's why a court later convicted him. Silent prayer is not criminalised under buffer zones law, as Vance, the vice president. I mean, it's an extraordinary evolution of the times when I would sit here and read something that Billy Buncher-Numbers had regurgitated on social media, partly perhaps as a consequence of Russian misinformation, farms pumping bills designed to undermine the West straight out of a St. Petersburg silo. And I would sit here calmly and I hope helpfully dismantling it and explaining to you what the actual law is or what the actual rule is. It started with Brexit, although I don't think that was particularly driven by Russian misinformation, not the specifics of it, but asking people, what law exactly is it you would like? I suppose it's become my career in a way. And there have been times when I have done it with people who are politicians, albeit slightly left field ones. I never thought the day would dawn when I had to sit here and explain to you the extent of the dishonesty being displayed publicly by the Vice President of the United States of America about our country. And on the issue of abortion, of all things. So the man, Adam Smith Connor, was found guilty of breaching a buffer zone, having been invited to move along and refusing. It's not about silent prayer. It's about enforcing the rules of a buffer zone, which have been brought in because of the vile abuse, the hideous pictures, the all sorts of propaganda that was being shoved down the metaphorical throats of vulnerable women seeking advice about terminating pregnancies. That's the story. The one he described in Scotland has absolutely no examples to back it up. Activities in a private place within the area between the protected premises and the boundary of a zone could be an offence if they can be seen or heard within the zone. So it's not about praying privately. It's about leaning out of your window and frightening, terrorising young women seeking to access an abortion clinic. Those are the facts, but the facts perhaps don't matter. You're absolutely right, Cameron. It is a misinformation. It's a stone-cold misinformation. The law that he broke was breaching a buffer zone, having been given every opportunity to move along. You cannot be arrested for praying privately in your own home. You can, however, be arrested within a buffer zone if you are recklessly and intentionally committing an offence. If you can be seen or heard within that zone by the young women. So you can pray wherever you want. Of course you can. It's about the rules of a buffer zone. I don't want to get bogged down in the detail of that because there is no detail to get bogged down in. You now know the facts. The Vice President of the United States of America must have known the facts when he gave this speech. But I don't get it. Having just given myself a big self-congratulatory pat on the back for having become somebody who likes to think of himself as an antidote to the misinformation and lies that are so commonplace in public discourse today. I suppose most obviously during the riots in the summer, but I don't get this. I don't understand what he's doing. I've read some fairly hair-raising analysis that they're trying to sort of reshape Europe in their own image. Trump went relatively fascistic at the weekend when he posted a claim that he who saves his country does not violate any laws, which is widely attributed to the French Emperor Napoleon. He who saves his country does not violate any laws. It also appeared in the manifesto of Anders Behring Breivik, the far-right mass murderer, the far-right terrorist, responsible for one of the worst massacres of our age, massacres of defenseless children. He who saves his country does not violate any laws. It's fascism 101. I cannot be breaking a law because I am me. So there are some pretty grim suggestions as to what is going on here. But I don't know. Why on earth, and I take any answer you've got to this, why on earth would a vice president of the United States stand up at a European security conference and tell America's historical allies not to worry about regimes that routinely murder critics and dissidents, up to and including on British soil, but not to worry about them, to worry instead about some made-up and exaggerated stories regarding abortion clinics in Bristol and in Scotland? Why? 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. What's his game? I'm not overthinking today, am I? Both questions this morning. Sometimes when I get in after a weekend on a Monday, my brain goes off in slightly unexpected directions. But this is one of the simplest questions I've ever asked you. But I don't know what the answer is. Why is he doing this? And it wouldn't have happened independently. There's no way this is not of a piece with policy or White House direction. How on earth? Why on earth? Because Badenoch, I can tell you, seems to be joining in today. I don't know whether that comes as a major surprise to you or not, but she seems to be joining in with this claim. You know, the leader of the opposition in a country where we know that Vladimir Putin will send murderers to kill people. She's speaking warmly about Donald Trump still, about JD Vance. I mean, it is genuinely extraordinary. The calculation must be that there is an audience. The calculation must be that there is a target, a goal, a jackpot, a seam, a rich seam to be mined. But she is now, I think, in a speech today, going to be urging Britons to fight for free speech. claiming that the state has overreached in its policing of people's opinions. I think if there's anything that typifies the 20 years in which I've been doing this job, it's that question. What is it that you think you're not allowed to say? My life changed when I first asked that question on the radio. My professional life changed that day. What is it you think you're not allowed to say? John in Hounslow it was. God knows when. It's sort of lost in the mists of time. What is it that you're not... What is this free speech that Kemi Badenoch thinks we have to fight for? What is it that these people are not allowed to say? And what is JD Vance playing at? There is no conspiracy theory alarm today, I have to tell you, because this is huge when you think about it. The policeman, if you like, of the world, for good or for ill. Please don't think I underestimate the malign influence of the CIA in other countries and beyond. But, you know, generally speaking, the United States of America is a guardian of liberal democracy against the totalitarian ambitions of a Joseph Stalin or an Adolf Hitler or a Mao Zedong. And he is telling us, the vice president is telling us, not to worry about Russia and China, but to worry instead about embellished and invented accounts of events outside abortion clinics in the United Kingdom. What is going on? 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. Don't hold back on the grounds that you think the answer is obvious, because I want all the answers I can possibly gather today. I want to harvest answers to this question. What on earth is going on? Because I'll tell you something for nothing. The bad stuff happens when you ignore it or you let it slide or you don't fully acknowledge the sheer scale of what is unfolding. This is unprecedented. This is the kind of speech you would expect Vladimir Putin to give to Russians who haven't got access to proper media. He would say things like, you don't know how lucky you are living in Mother Russia. Over in England, you're not even allowed to say prayers. That's the sort of speech that a propagandist would give about an enemy. And it's the Vice President of the United States giving it about a supposed ally. What is he playing at? 0345 6060 973.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 23 minutes after 11. I worry about hyperbole. I told you this last week. I don't like reaching for the F word too frequently, but Donald Trump has issued comments over the course of the weekend that look very much like a claim that he should be above and beyond any laws. He should be free to do whatever he wants because he's on a mission to protect a nation from unspecified threats. And when you ask what the threats are, you get JD Vance standing up in Munich telling us in Britain not to worry about Russia, whose president sends people here to kill critics, but to worry instead about a man being arrested for breaching a buffer zone outside an abortion clinic. What's his game? What's he up to? 0345 6060 973. Michael is in Kensington. Michael, what would you like to say?
How you doing, James? So I formulated my answer while I was waiting because this was a hard one.
Yes.
What is their game? So all of this misinformation and nonsense worked in the United States. And I think they are saying, okay, let's see if this is going to work abroad, because they no longer care about democracy. They no longer care about the things that the United States used to stand for. Flawed or not, the United States used to stand for democracy.
Yes.
And now they are just throwing everything at the wall to see what sticks and distracting everybody so that they can do what they want to do, which is suppress democracy, become autocratic, money and power. It sounds so cliche, but it's literally the simplest thing, and they're doing it in front of everybody, and their minions are cheering them on. When you see the red states that depend so much on federal money, and they are cheering that this guy Elon, who was not elected, who was not just this guy off the street who happens to be a multi-billionaire, coming in and going, yeah, you're not going to get that money. You're not going to get that money. And they're cheering him. that is what they think is going to happen over here. And I hope it doesn't.
And they just, I suppose this bit's easy. Why do they want it to happen over here? Answer, hyper-normalisation. Answer, the more the merrier. The more of this madness that's out there, the longer we'll get away with our own version of it.
I mean, on what planet is Putin now the buddy?
Do you think we are psychologically incapable of properly acknowledging the scale of a moment like this through a form of self-protection, psychological self-protection? That line, don't worry about what he says, just worry about what he does. That's a way of sort of saying no.
No, I think I am an undying optimist,
yes,
and I always truly believe that common sense and actual good will prevail. But I think please, I hate to blame social media, but the fact that every I can't even figure out a word that won't get censored on it. Every whatever can sit and put his opinion or her opinion out and reach billions is really a problem now. Because, like I said to your the person who I spoke to before, the producer, thank you. We're in a post-truth society now. Like, truth doesn't matter. It's just whatever is the loudest matters.
Let me zone you back. Let me zone you in, because I think what you've said about America and the richest man in the world going after the poorest children on the planet and taking away funding for things like cancer research and cancer treatment, well, as you say...
Ebola, taking away... Okay, on what planet is cutting research for disease control a good thing?
Yeah, I know.
Do you want to bleed out of your eyeballs? I don't.
On the planet where you're the richest man in the world, but you want more. That's the planet. You know that already. But I want to steer you back to that speech and to that end game, because the earlier caller reminding us about the foundations of NATO having a lot to do with tamping down, keeping a lid upon Nazism. The other bit that Vance did was essentially talk about the AfD and talk against the idea of not cooperating them because of their Nazi origins. I mean, this stuff is almost beyond comprehension. We have seen this movie, but why do they care? Why does Vance care? Why does he not just come to Munich and say what vice presidents have said for 50 years? What is he trying to incite?
The only thing that I can think is that people who are uneducated, who get information from not reputable sources, are easily... They're gullible, and therefore the numbers, they are just bringing in people to support their numbers and their cause.
So the mission continues. It's just a question of getting people to believe that they're under threat. That's the point, actually. If
the world is flat. The world is flat.
Yeah, but if people believe they're under threat and I am here to protect you, then I give you permission to do whatever you want. And that's why that line from Trump, that Napoleon echo from Trump over the weekend, is relevant to this conversation. They're trying to create a carte blanche, not just in the United States, but possibly in Europe as well. And you do that by persuading people that they're under threat. And they say, what are we under threat from? And they say, not the murderers over there in the Kremlin, but you're under threat from the police officers who arrested someone for breaking the law in Bristol. And somehow that works. Somehow that, I don't want to get too psychological, but somehow that wheedles its way into the minds of people. Because you can't focus, as I sometimes do, exclusively on the propagandists when you don't know whether they believe what they're saying or not. I don't think JD Vance believes any of this. Certainly not the JD Vance that wrote Hillbilly Elegy. But the people that do believe it are the important players on this pitch. The people who do believe it and what he is trying to get from them, which is permission to abandon all of the norms of Western civilization, whether it's democracy, as Michael has explained, or decency, which is a slightly more nebulous concept. What is his game? 0345 6060 973. Thomas Watts has your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
6 minutes to 12. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Strong stuff. And again, I don't know. Maybe, I don't know if I expressed it right to Michael. That sense of psychological self-protection. Oh, it can't be that bad. It wouldn't happen here. It can't happen on our watch. It's not the 1930s. And then these sort of moments occur. The idea that a United States vice president could tell you not to worry about Russia, which invades foreign countries and sends murderous goons to this country to kill people, but to worry instead about your own government and your own security services, your own lawyers, your own police officers. Hey, here's the thing. If you get a transcript of JD Vance's speech in Munich, right, I'm sure it's quite easy to get hold of. This is your homework for today. I want you to go through it with a highlighter and highlight anything in that speech that Vladimir Putin would be unhappy about. Okay, is anyone actually going to do that? How many people take me seriously? Enough. Go through the entire speech and highlight anything in it that you think Vladimir Putin would be unhappy about. Because at this point in proceedings, I can't see anything. He could almost have written it himself, Vladimir Putin. Don't worry about old Vladimir. He's okay. But let me tell you a story about something that didn't happen outside an abortion clinic in Bristol. That's what you should be really worried about. Who is this designed to appeal to? Dan points out it's half term, so you won't be getting your homework until Monday, James. I don't know that we observe half term on this programme. Colin is in Brighton. Colin, what would you like to say?
Oh God, I lived in the States for a couple of years.
Yeah.
Got moved there by my firm, and I think we're making it too complicated.
Ooh.
When you
press one for overthinking, Colin.
I just look at it simply. We've probably got very, very different politics, but this we can really agree on.
Go on.
I think Trump's a lunatic, but I think the American idea. When I worked there, it was a culture shock totally.
Yeah.
Because their idea of freedom is so different to our idea of freedom. We're much more realistic with it, whereas the Americans aren't. They regard freedom as being able to pretty much do what you want with no government control on it.
Yes, that's interesting, and that's why the gun legislation is the great divider between the two populations.
Yeah, whereas if they just admitted they like guns, we'd probably understand it a bit more. So their freedom. So JD Vance, I won't comment on his intelligence, but let's be honest, it doesn't take a lot to work out.
I disagree on that, actually. I don't think he's stupid by any stretch of the imagination.
I think he is. I don't think he's rational, though, with his thinking.
Okay, that's different.
He's very one-sided. He's religious for a start. He's a devout Christian, so he says.
Right.
Americans' idea of Christianity is very strange as well.
Yes.
So
none of this explains what he's doing in Europe, though. And neither does it explain... America hasn't changed under your analysis. This concept of freedom. No, this concept of freedom it goes right back to the founding fathers. It's the pioneer spirit. I get that.
Yeah, I agree.
But you've never had a US vice president before telling us. I mean that to not worry about Russia. This would have been like Ronald Reagan during the Cold War, saying don't worry about Russia. Worry about I don't know, someone being arrested for putting their recycling in the wrong bucket or something like that.
I think he sees that as a bigger problem, though, his own mind. So let's take the abortion clinic analogy. Yeah. In Britain, we're quite liberal about that. You know, we think it's...
So was America until last year. America had the same laws that we
were. No.
Well, they were legislatively speaking, they were.
100%. Legislatively, within the people itself, no.
So this is not a speech for Europeans. You think this was a speech for the audience at home?
Yeah, I think it's a speech for everyone. He looks at our freedom, so he looks at the abortion thing. I think it's a very rational idea. You should be. So we would see this is the free to and free from are two different freedoms. How we look at it.
Yes.
Americans think you are free to protest outside an abortion clinic, whether you have it or not. Regardless, that trumps all the rights of the woman to have, a bit of dignity in what she's doing and not be harassed. Whereas we see it free from being harassed. Same with the gun thing. You're free to own a gun.
That's a clever analysis. I've not heard that before.
We're free from getting our heads blown off.
Yeah.
Different ways of looking at it, but you've got to actually understand the American psyche with that.
Yeah, okay, so that works on a bit of the speech, but, the historical tradition in Germany that a party that has Nazi origins does not get to break bread with the mainstream parties, he's opposed to that as well. That's got nothing to do with free from and free to. That is saying don't oversweat the Nazis. They're not all that bad. Go and make friends with them.
But with all these parties, the same with Farage, really, who, when you look at his policies, Farage's, you think, actually, it makes a lot of sense, but what's behind them doesn't. That's the strange thing. So I think he looks at people like the AFD, good Christian white boys,
Yeah.
I think that's how he looks at it. And I think that trumps everything else. I think we're looking too deep and going, well, we need this, look at the politics and the makeup.
Maybe. I'm always happy to be accused of overthinking, but the Nazi stuff is different from the abortion stuff. He didn't meet the Chancellor of Germany. Instead, he met the leader of the AfD. And that's just rude, let alone dangerous or weird. And I can take some comfort from the idea that it's a speech designed for an audience at home, but I don't know how many parsnips that butters. This is from Blue Sky. Someone has posted this, sent this, replied to me on Blue Sky. The speech was designed to reach the media. A working class friend of mine who cares about her family, votes Labour, is not particularly politically engaged and doesn't read newspapers. She will always be my friend, but she recently told me that we can't say what we want to say in this country anymore. Ace writes, what is he up to? It's pretty straightforward. This is the man who told Americans, or his boss told Americans, they're eating the dogs, they're eating the cats. It's about flooding the zone, causing so much confusion and noise that people's amygdalas, that's the part of the brain, is forced into freeze, fight or fly. And they don't care which of those three you actually go for. I'm a big fan of Rosetta Stone's. If I get accused of overthinking things, I also like to oversimplify things. If you are embarked upon a campaign of pillage, if the only thing that they exist to do in the United States government at the moment is further enrich themselves, if they find any concept of taxation on the super wealthy unbearable because without it they'd be even richer than they are now, then you've got to persuade the people. Quick, look over there. It's an abortion clinic, and then I'll pick your pocket. Quick, look over there. It's an immigrant, and then I'll shut down cancer funding. Quick, look over there. Big distraction over there. Doesn't matter whether it's true or not. I just need to get you to look at it. And then while you're looking at it, I'm going to remove funding for disease research. Or I'm going to fire a bunch of nuclear workers and then have to rehire them a day later when I realise the full extent of what I've done. I don't know if it's that simple, but perhaps it could be. Colin, thank you. Simon's in Coulsdon. Simon, what would you like to say?
Right. Well, I mean, part of what I wanted to say was just said by the guy who's just been on about it being for a domestic audience. But I think the more concerning thing is something else that one of your callers said earlier on, which is this is not appeasement, it's alignment.
It's a good line, that, isn't it?
And I think that really
with Russia, alignment with Russia. Yes,
I think so. Yes, if you think about what Trump's been saying about Greenland and the rare earths there, and you got the rare earths in Ukraine. They've been flattening the cities, making it easy for mining. A lot of this is a resource grab. It's not about denazification or anything like that.
And, I'd normally push back at this point, but the offer has already been made, hasn't it, that we'll continue to defend you if you give us 50% of all the mineral rights in the country.
Well, I think so. And you've got the Belt and Road Initiative, which is also about resources. So Europe's getting squeezed. We're the meat in the sandwich. And I think we should be sticking together, which is another reason why I think Brexit was such a huge mistake.
Could you imagine a worse point? Is there a worse point in post-war history for the United Kingdom to be out on its own in the context of Europe? It's absolutely extraordinary. And don't forget that the first round of Trumpism cited Brexit as a wonderful example and something to aspire to. Again, I'm back to that thing, Simon. I can't see a single syllable in JD Vance's speech that Vladimir Putin would object to. And yet every single democratically elected leader of a European country, with the possible exception of Viktor Orban, is going to have been absolutely spooked by what he said.
Well, it's scary. It's coming to a head.
Well, we shall see. But again, that's a master plan, and I'm a little bit wary of a master plan as opposed to, quick, look over there while I pick your pocket, or look over there while I pillage your country, while I pillage your economy. Paulette tells me that George Monbiot has written, Trump and his Death Eaters cannot tolerate any rival power. Europe, when united, is a major trading and diplomatic bloc. They see Russia, much less of a threat to US hegemony, as an excellent instrument for breaking up Europe by threat or by force. But then I come back to the why of it. Why would they want to do? Why would they be so mean? Why would they care? You withdraw from NATO, you withdraw from Europe. You don't want Europe to then emerge stronger from that process because it no longer has the support of America. But why not? Again, these are mysteries for the ages, but they are questions that need to be asked. And Kemi Badenoch will give a speech today, or perhaps she's already given it, in which she's essentially aligning herself with JD Vance with the bloke who tells us to be more worried about made-up stories involving abortion clinics in Scotland than about governments and regimes that invade sovereign territories and send murderous goons to these shores to kill British citizens. He's giving a speech in which she's going to cite that headmistress who keeps calling herself the strictest headmistress in the country. It's true, isn't it? I oversimplifying or overthinking, I'm not sure which. But the kind of people that used to post absolute gibberish on Twitter, they're now in charge in the United States of America and in the Conservative Party. It's extraordinary. It's 11:45.
James O'Brien on LBC.
11:48 is the time. It's funny, talking last week to a Romanian caller who was reminding us that the last presidential election in Romania was annulled as a consequence of acres of evidence of Russian interference. And another element of JD Vance's speech, I think, involved complaining about the annulling of the election result in Romania. This from a regime or an administration that is demanding widespread lies about the election result in America in 2020, which, of course, Donald Trump tried to annul. So this is the thing that you have to cling on to when you think you're going mad. The absolutely incontrovertible evidence of hypocrisy or inconsistency or contradiction, actually, most obviously. So it doesn't matter how many people there are shouting at you, black is white, black is white, black is white. You have to remind yourself that they will claim the polar opposite the next day. And another really good example comes from Kemi Badenoch today. So JD Vance gives a speech claiming that prayer can get you arrested. And Kemi Badenoch gives a speech today, and she allies herself with him and with Trump. She gives a speech today praising that headmistress who banned prayer. You remember the school in London where kids who were praying in the playground were ordered not to. So make your mind up, lads. Is praying in public something that should be protected at all costs, even when it breaches a legal buffer zone? Or is praying in public something that should be banned when it's happening in a school playground? So Kemi Badenoch can't answer that question. No shocks there. She can't seem to answer any questions, apart from how does one become working class, to which the answer is, of course, do a shift in McDonald's. But what is it that I'm supposed to be worried about when she tells me that our ideas and our culture have dominated the world for well over 2 centuries? This is not a crisis of values. It is a crisis of confidence that has set in at exactly the same time that we face existential threats. She claims that there is an embarrassment of the West's legacy and even a hatred of Western history and even its culture. Western civilization is in crisis. What is she talking about? We may get onto this tomorrow. I live in this country. I hope that doesn't come as a major shock to anybody. I have no idea what she's talking about. But when you reflect upon what she's saying about praying, she's literally praising this teacher for defending Western civilization because she banned praying. Whereas JD Vance was claiming last week that the United Kingdom's freedoms were under threat from a ban on praying that doesn't exist. There's an actual ban on praying that does exist, and Kemi Badenoch says that's defending Western civilization. And yet when a bloke refuses to leave a buffer zone, he was not arrested for praying, he was arrested for refusing to leave a buffer zone, having made it clear that he was there in reference to the fact that it was an abortion clinic. That's a sign of the end of civilization as we know it. I wonder if anyone will pick her up on that. I wouldn't hold your breath, but next time she pops up in an interview, say, so hang on, that praying that needs to be protected by law, but banning that praying in that playground is fine. It's extraordinary, isn't it? This is what I mean about the threads are so easy to tug, and yet the fact that so few people bother to even try perhaps provides a part of the answer to the question I'm asking you this hour, which is what is JD Vance playing at? And John in Wembley is here to answer that question. John, what would you like to say?
I would like to say, James, I think it's all about pushing a nationalistic religion, Christian.
Yes.
First of all. Secondly, it's about wiping out women's rights in abortion and in the workplace. and making sure to a point, or promoting that they stay at home and produce babies, hopefully white babies. Because if you look at in Europe, all the countries, Portugal, Spain, Germany, all got aging populations, and they're all manufacturing bases, and the only people who are going to work in those manufacturing businesses, jobs, are immigrants, and that can't be the plan going forward for JD Vance. Because you
can't be opposed to immigration.
Say again?
You can't be opposed to immigration as violently as they pretend to be without providing demographic alternatives, and that would be women giving birth, massively increasing the domestic birth rate.
Well, yeah, because
and that becomes an international project then.
Yes, it is. That's why they're having a go at England. England's got a birth rate problem amongst the white population. It's an ongoing thing, and look what they've. Well, this is what I've heard. You can tell me if it's true or not. Is it true that Trump signed an executive order that allowed white South Africans to immigrate to America?
That's easy to check. Off the top of my head, I don't know.
Yeah.
But I'm not Google, John, for heaven's sake, man. I've seen something with reference to South Africa and Trump. But, of course, Elon Musk is South African, isn't he?
Yeah. But there's a theme here. When Trump...
What you're describing white supremacism.
He said, why isn't there immigration coming from Norway and Sweden? It's an ongoing thing. And that's where I think it's all going. They've taken away abortion rights of America. They want it transferred over here. Hence the reference to the abortion thing. So trying to get some sort
of international project off the... I mean, the more we talk about it, in some ways, the harder it is to choose between the really quite straightforward explanation and the chaos theory, if you like. The idea that it is just all about flooding the zone with so much stuff that you don't notice what they're actually doing. But you've managed to knit the two together by coming up with an account of what they are actually doing. I don't know. I know there's been some concerns that the cuts in aid to South Africa would leave things like HIV prevention and HIV treatment horribly, horribly underfunded. But I don't know the specifics of the thing that you asked. We'll have a look. Someone will know, and I'll be able to tell you before 12 noon today. That notion of threat. How can anybody, and I know people do, listening to this program right now, feel more threatened by this claim that you're not allowed to say what you want to say anymore, even though you can't tell me what it is? I was going to tell you that story. Well, the very first caller who said that to me, when I started doing this job many, many moons ago, so you can't say what you want in this country without being called a racist, is what he said. And I said, well, go on, I won't call you a racist. What is it that you want to say? And he said, there are too many Pakistanis in Hounslow. And I lived in the London borough of Hounslow at the time. I still do. So I was struck by what he said, although he was speaking about the specific town of Hounslow, which has got a very large British Asian population. And I said, well, I'm not going to call you a racist for saying that. What is the thing that you think you can't say? And there's this incredible pause. This is in the days before we clipped things up, so it didn't go viral. There's an incredible pause. And he said, they smell. And I thought, oh, crikey. You know how live radio works. You've listened to the show enough. Sometimes I get a little bit blindsided by contributions. And I thought, well, I mean, I've said I'm not going to call him racist. I'm not, and I don't feel any particular need to. He's adamant that he's not allowed to say these things. He's now said them on the radio. So I said, what do they smell of, John? And there's quite a long pause. And he said, curry, James. And I thought again, okay, hadn't probably thought this one through in advance, but let's see where we go next. And so I did another little pause, and I said, do you like curry, John? There's another pause, and he says, yes, James. And that was the first introduction for me to the mindsets of people who believe what liars like JD Vance and latterly Kemi Badenoch and Nigel Farage tell them when they say that they're not allowed to say what they want anymore in this country, or that their freedoms have somehow been eroded. What is it that you want to say? And then they say it, and it falls apart. Unless, of course, they want to say the other stuff, like I like apartheid, or I like white supremacy, or I want to bring back colour bars. Do you see what I mean? What is it that you're not allowed to say that you want to say? And that's where JD Vance's flirtation with the AfD is interesting. Him telling German politicians to stop being so perturbed by the Nazi roots of this political party. Hey, just chill out. So what if they have roots in Nazism? So what if they were born from the ashes of the actual Nazi party? How dare you sit in judgment on that there? Just edge ever closer to them saying the things that actually are unacceptable. But there's absolutely no evidence in Kemi Badenoch's speech or in JD Vance's speech or in any of the callers to this programme over the last 20 years that you're not allowed to say what you want in this country. So next time someone tells you that they're not allowed to say what they want, ask them, what is it you want to say? I sat next to a woman at jury service last week who was telling me that, or telling the people on her table, I was at the adjoining table in a state of ever-increasing incredulity, that Michelle Obama is a man, that Vladimir Zelensky spends all the aid money, all the military support that he gets on yachts for himself. All of this stuff. I mean, everywhere you go. Oh, you can't post stuff on Twitter. Well, no, you can't encourage people to set fire to hotels on Twitter. You can't incite, but you can't do that in real life either. You can't march out into the street now and give the name and address of a building that a rampaging mob already on the streets you want them to be directed towards. You can't do that in any context. If there's no rampaging mob, the legal response is going to be a little bit different to when there is, and you're fanning flames that are already burning. So that narrative, that entire political movement that you can't say what you want anymore, is a lie.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It's 3 minutes after 12. You often ask me for a little bit of advice on dealing with an unpalatable news agenda. I think more than ever, it's a very, very important time to consult foreign news sources, particularly in Europe. And the English language versions are pretty much ubiquitous, such is the nature of technology, as you know. They've all got almost immediate translation. So, with regard to that Vance speech that we were talking about in the last hour, have a look at what Le Monde has to say, have a look at what the Kyiv Independent has to say, have a look at what German media has to say about it. And then, of course, you don't need any translation services to have a look at what the New York Times has written. In fact, I'll tell you what the New York Times wrote, that the US administration has done nothing less than offer what may be a preview under Mr. Trump of a redefinition of a transatlantic relationship built on post-war bonds of stability between allied governments. It reminded readers of a speech Putin gave in 2007 demanding the rollback of American influence and a new balance of power in Europe more suitable to Moscow. So I just off the top of my head in the last hour suggested to you that if you went through JD Vance's speech, you wouldn't find a single syllable that Vladimir Putin objected to. The New York Times goes further, reminding us that, of course, after that speech in 2007, he didn't get what he wanted. If you were to take that speech at face value, then, according to the New York Times, Trump officials had made one thing clear. Putin has found an American administration that might help him realize his dream. And again, I praise my callers. I hadn't seen this New York Times article, but we had a caller earlier saying it's not appeasement, it's alignment. And here is a New York Times editorial saying that there are fears the US might now, quotes, align with Russia and either assail Europe or abandon it altogether. Such a shift, the paper said, would amount to a previously unthinkable victory, far more momentous for Putin than any objectives in Ukraine. So that's the New York Times, accused really of dereliction of duty in the presidential campaign, I think probably fairly, but not pulling its punches. And it is echoed by media all over the place, except here. Make of that what you will. Instead, you've got an article in the Daily Mail by Andrew Neil saying this is all long overdue and Europe had it coming. An alignment of the White House with the Kremlin. And much, if not most, of the British media is either ignoring it, denying it, or incapable of properly processing it. But we're going to talk about something completely different now. I love this topic, and my job, as ever, is to make you as interested in it as I am, even if you are not immediately. How old are you? First question. All right, and I like unless you're in company or it's inappropriate to do so, I think it would be nice for you to answer that question out loud. Okay, I think it's good. It's good to, especially if you're at home on your own or working from home. I want you to answer my next few questions out loud. All right, unless you're on a bus and you're going to scare somebody or something like that. So, how old are you? Okay, thank you. Really? You look younger. And when you were a child and you were in trouble at school, whose side were your parents on? Generally speaking. Yeah, thought so. So what age do you think is the point at which that pendulum starts to swing back? So I'm 53 years, I know, unbelievable. And with one or two rather glorious exceptions, my parents' generation, and indeed my own parents, would almost always be on the side of the school in the event of a contretemps, or in the event of a dispute, or in the event of a punishment even, in the event of trouble. The parents and the teachers were a united force in the education of the child. Yeah? Where are we going to put the age? Teachers, everyone's home. I said do it out loud, not text me. Honestly, pay attention at the back. So where do you think the age is? So 53, 43? Parents or teachers? Teachers still for you. What about you? Parents or teachers? Whose side would they be on? Your side or the teacher's side? Still the teacher's side. You're quite square though. Yeah. I was quite naughty. And so this story, I suspect, is the tip of a particularly ugly iceberg. A head teacher has been paid damages to settle a legal claim against parents who he alleged launched a campaign of harassment against him, including turning up at his family home. He is the head of a high school in Birkenhead, and two parents, the parents of two former pupils, stood accused by him of harassment. The abuse allegedly began when the parents accused him of bullying their daughters after they were given detentions for breaking school rules, such as using their phones. And they also claimed that he had failed to intervene when one of their daughters was herself being bullied. So the alleged harassment included, allegedly, an online fundraiser to remove Kevin Flanagan from his role as head teacher, a Families Fight Flanagan Facebook group, that's rather agreeably alliterative, but it can't have been much fun for him, and an Instagram account which encouraged online abuse towards him. He's exactly the same age as me, interestingly enough, because I think there's a generational element to this conversation, to this issue. They've also been accused of confronting him and the school's co-chair of governors outside their family homes and pursuing the head teacher's partner in a dangerous and threatening way while driving, something they denied. In January, the Sunday Times picked up on this story yesterday. It's repeated in The Guardian today. The parents concerned agreed to pay him £10,000 in costs and damages to bring his legal action to an end. This as well as agreeing to restraining and non-harassment orders. Flanagan himself said the last near 2 years have been a hugely upsetting and traumatic period, not only for myself, but for my family, colleagues and the broader school community. And he felt he had no choice but to bring legal proceedings. The governors couldn't deal with the situation. The family, who denied harassment and argued, wait for it, their right to freedom of speech. So maybe that's what Kemi Badenoch is talking about. I'm not allowed to abuse my children's head teacher or turn up outside their house to shout at them anymore in this country. My freedom of speech is... I was not expecting to knit this story into the one that we were talking about in the last hour, but there it is. Make what you will of this family, who set up all the online groups, allegedly, and the Facebook groups, and the Instagram accounts and the rest of it, and the campaigns. I bet there was a petition, but they claimed they were exercising their freedom of speech over what they believed was the poor treatment of their daughters. The social media account managed to attract all manner of people with grievances against the school, including previously excluded pupils. There were references to the head teacher's children, to the head teacher's children's ethnicity. They also filed complaints to Ofsted, the Wirral Council, Department for Education and the Teacher Regulation Agency. It looks almost like a full-time job to cause this man stress. And the Education Secretary said last night that she was concerned about the volume of complaints against schools and the degree to which that can take up staff time. There's a harassment law specialist at Brabner's, and he is a harassment law specialist. I heard a lawyer earlier opining on the Human Rights Act who has never been a human rights lawyer in his life. So it's important that you're getting lawyers who are actually speaking from within their field of expertise. And he said teachers are increasingly being subjected to antisocial behaviour at the hands of parents and other individuals. He added that discourse and legitimate challenge are an integral part of our society, but teachers need greater protection to work free from harassment. I was drawn to this story for two reasons. The first I've told you about. I'm fascinated by pendulums, generational pendulums, the way in which our attitudes change through the ages and then quite often change back again. And I would put the age at which your parents were more likely to side with you against your teachers quite low. I would say if you are now in your mid-30s, then perhaps your parents would have been less likely to just take your school's word for it. And the other reason I was drawn to this story is because it's half term. And that means that teachers will be listening. And some of them will have long and glittering careers. And they will be able to tell me 1, 2, or 3 things. The first is, what's it like? I mean, how bad is it now? Education Secretary is warning against it. This, I have to hope, is an extreme example. But the harassment of a teacher by a pupil's parents, has it happened to you? 0345 6060973. I'm interested also in what we think has changed socially. Why do we think? I mean, if you're going to answer this question, you can have a go at where we think the age is. Where do you think this comes from? The idea teachers historically were in loco parentis. It's Latin, that is. In loco parentis, in the place of parents. So that means that the parent and the teacher are, if you like, a united force in the education of the child. And I don't think that's true anymore. I think this is an extreme example, but I think the general experience will be that when a teacher tells off a child, a younger, more modern type of parent somehow feels personally affronted. And I don't know where that comes from. But you do, and you're going to tell me by dialing 0345 6060973. So I think that's the best way into this. The first two thoughts that occur to me are probably going to be the best. What's it actually like when a parent, and if you've got 30 years on the clock as a teacher, you can really tell us about the difference now. Parents' Evening. There was a great cartoon. We've touched on this topic once before, and someone sent me a brilliant cartoon about then and now. I can't actually remember the detail of it, but I promise it was brilliant. Someone will find it and send it to me, I hope. So that idea that back in the day, on Parents' Evening, for example, you would say, Keith is not pulling his weight. In fact, they're not laughing with him, they're laughing at him. Keith is a disgrace. Keith needs to work harder. Keith's homework is should come with a health warning. So, and the parent at Parents' Evening would go, Keith, and give him a metaphorical clip around the old ear roll and say, you need to pull your socks up, son. Otherwise, you won't be going on holiday this summer, or you'll be washing my car every weekend for the. So do you see what I mean? So you'd be there on Parents' Evening and you would criticise constructively the child and the parents would join in and take it at face value. I think now that is not a given. I think now it's possible, if not probable, that when you criticise a child, the parents take offence. You can almost catch yourself doing it at Parents' Evening. It's your natural impulse is defensive. I don't think that was my parents' natural impulse. If they sat down and a teacher said he's not working very hard, they would tell me off. Now, if someone says your child's not working very hard, I don't want you to think I'm criticising everybody else. I get that impulse where you go, hang on a minute, they've had a lot on their plate this year. I don't think you fully appreciate. There's just a defensive impulse that I think is new. Not necessarily bad, because not to cast too dark a shadow over a conversation that doesn't have to be too bleak. A lot of the reasons why the worst kind of abuses unfold in school scenarios is because of an undeserved authority. It's like church, you don't ever say bad things about the priest. The teacher is always telling the truth. The child will not be believed. So I do understand the dangers of going too far towards always siding with authority, or the two authorities, parental and scholastic authority, both siding against the child, as it were. But I want to know what it's like. I want to know, A, what it's like in the moment of it happening, but B, for older teachers, how you track the change, the swing of this pendulum that I posit has swung in the course of my lifetime, from a place where teachers and parents generally believe each other, and the child is therefore facing a united force, to a place now where the parent sees criticism of the child as a personal affront. Okay? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. And you will get through. It's half term, so you've got no excuse. Well, it might not be half term for you, but if it is half term for you, you've got no excuse at all. So there it is. I want you to talk to me about the reality of what actually happens, but also why. What's changed in our society, for good or for ill, because you may not think this is a bad thing, but what's changed in our society that makes it more likely now for a parent to respond to constructive criticism of their child, or punishment of their child as well, detention, in a negative fashion, as in to take the child's side against authority. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. It's 12:18.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 20 minutes after 12. It's not just in school, James writes this texter. I'm a tennis coach and the parents want a transactional exchange. They pay me and therefore the child will become a great player. If they don't, or you leave them out of the team, then they want their money back. There's nothing about teaching them to access the game for life. I like this. My brother was a naughty boy. This is perfect from Mark. All right, this is what I'm talking about. This is what I would call how it used to be. My brother was a naughty boy in school in the 90s. He had frustrated a teacher so much that the teacher grabbed him by the scruff of the neck and held him to the wall. My brother gloated that he'd tell our mum and she'd have him sacked. My mum, who was not a woman to cross, went into the school that afternoon and forced my brother to apologise to the teacher, as she felt he must have done something really bad to make the teacher lose control in that way. Apparently the teacher was very relieved. That's perfect, because that shows you the dangers as well of not properly holding teachers to account. Some parents would not have been forgiving or understanding in that case, and no teacher should ever physically discipline a child. I speak as someone who was routinely beaten formally by teachers. And the question of why things have changed, Oliver raises a point I should probably have thought of myself. Teachers, along with other public sector workers, have been routinely demonised for decades. It doesn't take a genius to work out the rest. So when teachers feel they have little choice but to take industrial action after decades of real-term wage growth, and you turn on your radio and someone is attacking teachers, for example, maybe the person listening then becomes more likely to attack a teacher in a rather more real sense, a less rhetorical sense, either through a campaign of harassment, like the one that we're looking at in the newspapers today, or simpler instances of abuse. I don't know. Ryan's in Bath. Ryan, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello,
it's the first time calling, quite nervous.
It's only me.
Yeah, so my stepdaughter, she goes to a school in West Yorkshire, and her attitude was sort of going downhill a bit. We noticed it when she came home from school.
Yeah.
So my partner rang the school to basically work with the teachers to try and understand why her behaviour is going downhill. And one of the teachers said to my stepdaughter, sort of while she was in a lesson, look, I'm going to fill your homework book full of gold stars just to keep your mum off our back.
Right. What's the point that you're making?
Well, it just seems like, gone are the days where parents will work with teachers. It seems like the teachers were just there to teach a curriculum and not understand the children and what they're going through. You know, ringing up as a parent, you want the teachers to work with you to make sure your child's happy and doing well in school. Yeah. But certainly in this instance, it was, you know, I'm going to fill your homework book with these gold stars to keep your mum off our back, and not really care, basically.
Right. I don't really understand the story, but I mean, you're being negative towards teachers, whereas possibly not realising that that's part of the problem we're describing rather than the solution. So parents, and you've said this in front of your stepdaughter, have you?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, so now she thinks that the teachers are the problem, not her.
I mean, that's
so you've given her permission. You've given her permission to malign her teachers by maligning her teachers to her.
I mean, you know, we teach her to be respectful towards teachers, but it just seems
you've just told her that they don't care.
Well, I mean, they don't. We still teach her to have respect for, you know, authority, but
you don't. You know, you've done the opposite.
No, she's still respectful in class, but you know, when we try to get my words out here properly.
That's all right.
But you know, she's still respectful. We bring her up in a respectful household. She's not rude to teachers, but it's the environment, and it's an underperforming school that's causing her to fall that way as well. And you want the teachers to work with your child.
What's your responsibility in this space?
Well, to bring her up with as much respect as possible.
No,
I mean,
I'm thinking more about education, not respect. It's always a difficult thing to pin down. Because I mean, you are disrespecting her teachers to her, but possibly accurately. Obviously, I don't have all the details in front of me, and I'm not entirely clear on what the problems she was having at school are. I mean, she just wasn't enjoying school. She wasn't engaged at school.
She was basically falling behind because of all the others in her class. You know, you become your surroundings, essentially.
Right. And the teachers have to deal with that as well.
Yeah, exactly. And
so your daughter's excuse for falling behind is the distraction of the other people in the class, but the teacher's job is to deal with that as well as deal with your daughter. So their job just got twice as hard.
Yeah, 100%. And you know, and she's been disciplined, you know, because of that. And you know, we're trying to bring her on the right path.
Yeah.
The challenge is, and I don't envy teachers, is, you know, it becomes a sort of downward.
But you are siding with the child against the teacher, as opposed to my parents' generation, possibly your parents' generation, when they would have sided with the teacher against you.
100%.
Yeah.
No matter the circumstances, my parents would have come down on me like a ton of bricks.
Yeah, it's interesting how things change, and also how sometimes we can't see how they've changed, even as we're in the middle of it. And where does that come from? 0345 60 60973. Because I mean, listen, Ryan raises a point that needs to be articulated. It may be for the better. I don't personally think that it is, but I have quite an oddly. And also I've got two daughters who've never had any trouble at school. So the idea that if they were naughty like I was, I'd have the same attitude to discipline that my parents had is entirely notional, entirely theoretical. Maybe you welcome, as a teacher or as a parent or as a former child, which most of us are, maybe you welcome the idea that the parents don't automatically take the teacher's side in a dispute, because you know that teachers can be liars or can be undeserving of your respect and your support. Will's in Twickenham. Will, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Yeah, hi. So my partner's a primary school teacher, has been for 20 years or so. And we were just kind of listening in and discussing it. And, you know, our feeling is that...
you're not. Just to be clear, you're not a teacher.
I'm not a teacher, okay. No. She was less keen to call in than I was, so... it's more... I think the shift is about the shift towards looking after kids' mental health more so than, you know, how they achieve academically. And I think in most ways that's a positive thing. And I think the fact that, you know, we're more inclined to, you know, protect our kids in that way rather than, you know, give them a clip round the ear as
the question really is about teachers being harassed by parents and abused by parents for...
Right.
I don't know where mental health comes into that.
Well, what I'm saying is, if you're going in for a parents' evening and, they're saying you're not, the kid's not doing this, he's not doing that, and like you were saying, the homework's not great, whatever. I think
Keith, let's give the child a name. Keith's homework's not great.
Let's say Keith's homework is pretty poor.
Yeah, very
I think
poor.
we're very poor. I think we're more inclined to, not be so harsh on our kids now, because I think the shift from what we achieve academically versus how our kids' mental health is more. It's more important for kids to be.
I like this. This is a generous analysis of it, but the teacher is more concerned about that than ever before as well. I'm thinking of, Keith being my example. I'm thinking of someone who deserves a metaphorical clip round there. There's nothing wrong with his mental health at all. He's just lazy and he's naughty.
If Keith feels that he's been rounded on by both his teachers. Both teachers and his parents,
and his presenter,
maybe his mental health will suffer. Maybe Keith's all right now, but further down the line, he thinks, "Well, hang on, everyone's turning against me here." And maybe our job now as parents is more about let's keep Keith's mental health in check, rather than let's make sure Keith gets a load of A's at school.
Yeah, I do. I like this, I said I think that there might be a positive analysis of it, and that you are providing it. But when does constructive criticism come into the equation? So I speak, and there's always a danger when you're talking about education that you think every single child is a little version of what you were like at that age.
Yeah, that's true.
I needed fairly strict teaching. I really did. I don't know whether or not, why, but I didn't do work unless I absolutely had to, and even then sometimes I didn't. So where does constructive criticism come into this?
No, I agree. We've got a 9-year-old boy who's bright, but our last parents' evening, he was described as doing the minimum.
But
there you go. But still being pretty good. If he pushed himself, he could probably be better, but I'm not worried about that. I'm worried that he grows up as a happy kid and that he, enjoys his childhood much more than whether or not he achieves academically.
It's not either or, is it, Will?
It's not either or. No, it's not. But one, to me, is much more important than the other.
Like that. Yeah, me as well, actually. When push comes to shove, if you had to choose between the two, then happiness is much more important than academic achievement, although we may reconvene in 20 years' time and rue the day that we didn't come down a little bit harder on our children. You've opened up a different line of conversation. I'm more interested originally, although not necessarily still, in the excessive reactions of parents, the parents who are not safeguarding the mental health of their children, but who are instead feeling almost a personal affront at any criticism of their child. So this case in the Sunday Times, you don't end up handing £10,000 to the head teacher unless you've overstepped several marks, I would argue. And I'm wondering what it's like to be on the wrong end of that overstepping, that harassment. I mean, that's the word you would use. And the elements that they were objecting to, the elements of teaching that they were objecting to, were as simple as getting detentions for breaking rules. So it's not just, I probably shouldn't have used Keith as an example in the context of his homework, but if Keith was breaking the rules and getting a detention, I'm kind of imagining a parent marching up to the school saying, "No one puts Keith in the corner. No one puts my child in detention," that kind of attitude. But I probably had a lesson from Will there, appropriately enough, on treating the subject with a little bit more nuance. 12:31 is the time. Amelia Cox has your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It's 12:35. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Here we go. These are a bit closer, perhaps, to what I was expecting or asking for this hour. Matt makes a great point. I can't call. I'm in hospital. Get well soon, mate. I've been teaching for 20 years. It's always been the case that some parents will really back their kids, despite observable facts. Since COVID, though, it's really exploded, James. Too often now I meet parents and you can sense that they're thinking, yeah, whatever, mate, I did your job during lockdown. And this has perpetuated the myth that too many teachers just want to bully the kids. Oliver's point about the demonisation of public sector workers we've already heard. And this is good from, actually, I better just check to the end to make sure that I'm not giving away the name of someone who's asked not to be named. It's from Anthony. I'm the head of a core faculty at a school in Hertfordshire. At our school, parent WhatsApp groups are a huge problem. The anti-teacher rhetoric shared on there is scary at times. We have a member of staff who is also a parent and therefore in the group, but we see parents campaigning and encouraging pylons against individual teachers. It's now rare for parents to support teachers when sending any emails about behaviour, etc. They regularly come back with the accusations against teachers as a way to explain their child's behaviour. A lot of my time as head of faculty is spent shielding my team from these emails. And on a very similar theme, a friend of mine quit teaching in school after 6 months for this exact reason, James. He would tell children off and have parents knocking on his door. Parents don't parent the same way as our parents did. I'm 35. So if someone tells their child off when they wouldn't have done so in that situation, they may feel shown up by that teacher. Gosh, it happened to us just this weekend. My 1-year-old son got pushed on a trampoline by a 9-month-old. Oh, no, by a 3 to 4-year-old. I thought you were saying a 3/4 of a year-old, but no, it wouldn't have been that, would it, physically? Waiting for the parent to apologise to him and to us and to tell off their own child, but it didn't happen. If it was the opposite way round, I would have told them off and removed them from the trampoline, and that's from Chris, who's in Maidstone. I like the analogy between parenting and teaching, but I don't like the tale from Anthony of entire WhatsApp groups essentially dedicated to organised harassment of teachers, born of an idea. No one tells my child off. I don't know. I don't like, as you know, I don't like simplistic or lazy answers in this field because no two children are the same and no two parents are the same. But something significant has changed on a big enough level. And Rich has found a couple of contenders for that cartoon I couldn't remember. I'll describe those to you shortly. But first, Georgia is in St Ives. Georgia, what would you like to say?
Oh, I'm spitting feathers here.
I think that means thirsty as opposed to angry. I don't want to be a pedant, Georgia, but I used to say...
I could do with a drink.
Yeah, there you go. Carry on.
I work in a school and I'm no longer teaching, but I'm pastoral. Yes. And I've been there for 18 years now. So I've seen it change completely. And, a lot of the trouble is some of the parents nowadays want to be their child's friend, not their parent. They're frightened to set boundaries. Yes. They're frightened to, make their children learn that actions have consequences.
Yes.
And, it's very difficult. We've got a particular parent who lives literally, 100 yards from the school. And if their child's got put into the reflection room, into the detention for reasons, genuine reasons, not just being picked on, they're straight up the school. And it's, upsetting the receptionist and upsetting everybody.
How aggressive are they when they arrive at the school?
Not as much nowadays,
right?
But used to be quite aggressive.
Really?
We do have quite a few aggressive parents, yes.
And that's new, right? And 18 years ago, that they would be as rare as hen's teeth.
Absolutely, yeah. They'd be on your side.
Staying with oral analogies, they would have been as rare as hen's teeth.
Yes.
What do you think's changed? I like that phrase, trying too hard to be their child's friend. I understand what that means. It's a bit glib, though. What do you think has changed? And when? I mean, can you pinpoint a moment of change or the first time it started happening?
I can't. I think maybe parenting has watered down since I was a child. Whereas, strict, I knew that if I did anything wrong at school, I'd get double trouble at home.
Yeah, same.
But nowadays, parents don't seem to care. Or they've got a detention. Oh, well, never mind. It's not encouraging them to do their homework. And it's not setting them up right for outside of school life. The parent that keeps coming up when their child, has something wrong. What are they going to do when the child's at work? Are they going to continue to wipe the child's backside for them, in every little thing that happens in their life? And I feel sorry for them.
Yes, well, I mean, you put it like that, and I do too. It's a funny one, isn't it? That notion of the in loco parentis is gone out of the window because they're not even in parentis. They're not doing the things that we would have. I've got that other call in the back of my mind, though, about being more concerned about your child's happiness than their academic results. But that's not the same as supporting disruptiveness or supporting bad behaviour, defending it. My child cannot have. Dare anyone tell my child off because that is an affront to my dignity. That's where I think the problem lies. Thank you, Georgia. Jen's in Attleborough. Jen, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello.
I'm a retired head, and before I start telling you, the only reason I'm ringing today is because I'm retired, so I feel safe having this conversation with you.
Gosh.
In 2008, I took on my first headship in a small village school, and it was a junior school, so 60 children came up from the infant school. Right. And there was a cohort of children that just didn't get on with each other, but their parents didn't get on with each other either.
Right.
So there was one little boy, I heard one day that the parents in the village had started a petition to exclude this child. So when I got wind of this, I contacted the person who was running this petition, and I actually said, this isn't acceptable. Exclusion, there are certain reasons why you exclude children. You don't just exclude them because you don't like them. Anyway, then I got wind of the fact that they'd started a petition to get rid of me.
I said earlier, didn't I, that petitions would be part of this process?
Yeah.
Bloody petitions.
This cohort of children and the parents were at the school for 4 years, and it was an absolute nightmare. It destroyed relationships. The governors had to get involved. The local authority had to get involved. The council, they wrote to Ofsted, just like the head teacher that you were talking about. And it was constant stress. And for the
it's hypervigilance, isn't it? The exhaustion of hypervigilance. Where's the next one going to come from? And is it going to be face-to-face? Is it going to be an email? Is it going to be a phone call from the LEA or whatever it is these days? All of that.
But the frustrating thing was that, when Ofsted came in fact, when the local authority came in, they could see that we were managing behaviour and recording all behaviour incidents really well. So, the parents were blindly doing this without, it was just an opinion they had. And anyway, in the end, I decided I'd had enough and I left.
Really? So in a way, they hounded you out, in a way, or not?
I mean, I didn't leave after those 4 years, but it was one of the big reasons that I left the school, and moved away from the area. Yeah.
Gosh, because the parents are just, getting a petition together to get a child what did they think would happen?
I don't know.
Get a load of signatures to get a child excluded from school.
But the interesting thing is, James, though, that there was another group of parents in the village who, when they got the knock on the door, they felt so bad and so disgusted about what was going on. They were the people that came to me and said, look, this is what's going on. We don't like it.
So they were going door to door to gather signatures?
Yeah.
People are mad, aren't they?
The other thing is, talk about social media, every time I stood up to deliver an assembly, I knew full well that at the end of the day, there'd be messages. And parents came in with their laptops to show me what was on Facebook. Did you see what happened in assembly today? Oh, it's disgraceful, isn't it? The behaviour. Just ridiculous. Every time I stood up and any time any member of staff stood up, we knew we were being watched and that, that the false narrative out there would just be put around and everybody would believe it.
What do you think changed? Briefly, Jen, socially speaking, in the course of your career, we've gone from relative normality into this madness that you describe. What would you attribute it to?
Well, interestingly enough, James, I went into teaching quite late. I'm the person who phoned you recently, who had the conversation with the American in the lift.
Oh, yes.
I'd spent 20 years in industry before going into education, so I can't really comment on what happened, 30 years ago.
But you are precisely the sort of person that the teaching industry is crying out for, and yet it's the parents that have created the what's the word I'm looking for? Repellent, almost, isn't it, from you continuing in the job? Thank you, Jen. I'm cracking on only because I'm late for this.
James O'Brien on LBC.
A variety of teachers then and now cartoons. My thanks to Rich and to Jane for bunging me a couple on Blue Sky. If you want to follow me on Blue Sky, I am at Mr. James OB. It's pretty much the only social media I use at the moment. So the most obvious one is the same vignette. Parents holding up a report card with an F on it, so the child's got an F in their grades. And in the good old days, the parents are berating the child, saying these grades are terrible. And in this cartoon in 2010, so not that recently, the parents and the child are berating the teacher, shouting these grades are terrible. It's about a power shift or a change of balance. That's one of them. That's quite a good one. There's another one which has got the parents saying to the child in the good old days, did you talk politely to your teacher? Whereas these days they are saying, did your teacher talk politely to you? Which again talks about a shift, doesn't it, in attitudes, in outlook. And then I think they're all variations on that sort of theme. The other thing that's just come in on Blue Sky is rather more serious from Steve, and pointing out, as you've just heard in the news bulletin there, Russia's Foreign Minister Lavrov saying there will be no role for Europe in Ukraine peace talks. This alignment between the White House and the Kremlin is happening at 1,000,000 miles an hour. And Steve reminds me, somewhat unhelpfully, that I was kind of joking last week when I posited the possibility of FDR phoning Hitler to come to some sort of agreement about the future of Poland. And doesn't seem so funny now, James. Right, Steve. It wasn't that funny at the time, but it wasn't actually it was a intellectual flight of fancy, if you like, rather than an actual direct comparison. But there it is. No role for Europe in Ukraine talks. No role for Europe in Poland talks. You tell me. Back to school. Vincent's in Bavaria. Vincent, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Good afternoon to you. Just want to give my viewpoint on this. I see this as an example of what I would say a declining moral code. And I would actually, because I said in Germany, I've lived here for 30 years, and my children were brought up in Germany. I'm not saying Germany is the best place on the planet, but certainly what I would say is that there is a very big acknowledgement that you're living in a society and that there are rules and that there is authority and an acknowledgement of authority, whether that be the teachers or whether it be the police or whatever. And I see that more and more it seems to become the case that people are becoming more living in a bubble, being more individualistic and demonstrating this to their children as well, that everything else outside of that bubble is kind of optional and is questionable. And I see that as quite dangerous.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't want to get into a Germany versus UK comparison, but there's plenty of political rhetoric in Germany claiming similar decline, isn't there? Otherwise the AfD wouldn't be doing so well. You're all degenerates.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, I think that's to do with the immigration issues that we have in terms of the amount that we take,
That idea that parents are now more emboldened here to resist. Well, maybe authority is the wrong word, and we should have talked about civic participation or something like that, or community.
No, and I'm all for that. Yeah, absolutely. I think that there should be a teaming, obviously with the powers that be, whether it be a teacher or the school or whatever. I'm not saying they have it right all the time, but certainly there is an acknowledgement that's needed.
You're at a different point on the graph when it comes to this pendulum, the swinging of the pendulum. It's a good point, because it's not just going to be confined to schools. It's in areas in which everybody feels a little bit more entitled than they used to do. Steve writes, James, the problem started with Mumsnet. I'll leave that one hanging. But two texts coming in, two Blue Sky messages coming in right next to each other, pertinent and interesting that they arrived in the same minute. Our daughter is a teacher, says Patricia. She was hounded by abusive parents after needing to chastise their disruptive son. They made her life hell until eventually she had to go sick with work-related stress. And Ben writes, I'm listening to your current topic with great interest. I'm a retired primary school teacher with 3 members of my family still teaching. My daughter-in-law has been signed off by her doctor last week due to stress. And of course, the same people who will be inviting you to hate on teachers when they take industrial action will be exactly the same people in my line of work who would poo-poo the idea of a teacher being signed off with stress, having been abused and harassed by parents. It's a funny old world. Thank you, Vincent. Lisa's in Luton. Lisa, what would you like to say?
Hello, Lewis.
Lewis. Carry on, Lisa.
That was for Lewis. If you were listening last week, you get the joke.
I think I got the joke, but I'm glad you've explained it. That's why I laughed.
Okay.
That's why I laughed. But of course, a lot of people listening won't have got the joke. So people said hello, James, to Lewis last week. So you've now said hello, Lewis, to James.
Yeah, I felt sorry for him. Anyway, as a former deputy head teacher, a teacher of 20 plus years, a parent,
yes,
I'm quite concerned by the narrative, and when a previous caller said that he spends his time shielding his teachers, I think what we as teachers have got to recognise is that in the same way that some teachers, it was rare, we believe, did abuse children, some teachers are racist. Some teachers are sexist. Some teachers do pick on children. So I think it's important that when we do receive complaints from parents, that we are seen to be impartial, because that's what ignites the WhatsApp groups. When the parents feel like they are not being listened to, and many of them may have had a negative experience themselves as a pupil. So when they recognise they're not listening, they are just shielding the teachers, then
I think, obviously, if we'd been talking about allegations of racism or abuse, then you'd be raising a really powerful and important point. But we're not. We're talking about a kid getting detention for breaking school rules, and the parents saying, "How dare you give my kid detention?" Or parents in a village putting a petition together because they want to get someone else's child excluded from school and bypass the proper system entirely. So while you're right, I don't think that the points you raise address the points that have been raised on the programme previously, where we've been talking pretty clearly about a previous presumption of solidarity between teacher and parent, whereas now a parent is affronted. Look, these parents have just paid £10,000 to a head teacher after parking up outside his house and shouting abuse at him. That's not a case of needing to take complaints more seriously, is it?
Right, we can all point to an isolated incident that is so unusual that it makes the mainstream media. But I think, generally speaking, there hasn't been a massive change. There have always been parents who have listened to their child and challenged teachers. And there have always been parents who assume that teachers will do no wrong. I think what's happened is we just generally, as a society, expect more.
Right, I'm glad I'm genuinely glad that's your experience, and I think the last bit is definitely true. But I mean, you are in a very lonely spot with regard to what pretty much every other teacher who's contacted the programme today is describing, particularly over the broad sweep of long careers, having gone from never ever really having a parent kicking off about the fact that their child has been told off to it now becoming relatively commonplace, up to and including the online, the WhatsApp groups combining to create these kind of problems, albeit the only bit about this story that's outstanding or is man bites dog territory as opposed to dog bites man is the fact that the head teacher took legal action against these parents and they've now paid him £10,000. I suspect the campaigns of harassment and abuse are rather more, well, I know they are because we've heard about a few today. Thank you, Lisa. 12:56 is the time. Apologies to Georgia in St Ives. Apparently, it was in the olden days that spitting feathers meant thirsty, and now it is widely regarded to mean angry. So I've been out pedanted there, because when I said I'm spitting feathers today about something, I got a bunch of messages saying, "Really, are you thirsty? Perhaps you should have a cup of tea." So I changed, and now I corrected Georgia, who said I'm spitting feathers because she was angry, and I said, "I think you'll find that means thirsty, actually, Georgia." And it turns out that the pendulum has swung. These bloody pendulums swinging all over the place. So it used to mean thirsty, and now it's widely regarded to mean angry. I'm spitting feathers about that, but I apologise to Georgia. Last word to this to Barry in Dagenham. You've got a minute, Barry. Make it count.
Okay, hiya, James. What it is, my wife has worked in education for about 34 years.
Yep.
Not as a teacher, but in the classroom, one thing and another. And she says that it's so noticeable, the change now between the teachers and parents, the way things are done. For instance, just about 6 weeks ago, one young child in the dining hall threw a glass of water over another child, witnessed by two adults and loads of children. The child started crying when she said, people said, "What are you doing that for?" "I didn't do it," she says.
So it's there. I mean, it's flipping out. It's like Brexit. There it is. I was ignoring the evidence of your eyes and ears, even in front of you. So that combination of entitlement and confrontation, Barry, I think you encapsulate perfectly. But I think probably if you had to pick one reason for it, and just tune into LBC next time teachers are on strike and find out how easy it is to encourage people to hate teachers. And if you're doing that to the adults, then it's just a short hop, isn't it, to doing it to the children. That's just a theory. That's it from me for another day. Should we do it all again tomorrow morning from 10? I think we should. If you missed any of today's show, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player, where you can also pause and rewind live radio, as well as listen to a range of podcasts, including James O'Brien Daily, the best bits of my show in 60 minutes every day. Download it now for free from your app store or head to to globalplayer.com. Coming up at 4 on LBC, it's Tom Swarbrick, but now it's time for Sheila Fogarty.
James O'Brien on LBC.